No one really wins a war, but some wars shouldn't have been fought at all. Not because they were too tragic, but because they were too stupid. Throughout history, humans have gone to battle over gold, land, pride, and sometimes over a bucket, a pig, or a pastry, sometimes even over a camel. These are not the wars you read about in school. These are the ones whispered about in the footnotes of history, where nations lose to birds, villages declare war on empires, and thousands die because someone trimmed the wrong beard. Tonight, we count down the top 20 most ridiculous wars ever fought. From real battles with real consequences, to causes so absurd you'll think we made them up. We didn't. Close your eyes, breathe in, and drift into a timeline where the rules of war make no sense, because humans never really followed them in the first place. Number 20. The War of Jenkins' Ear. It began, as many ridiculous wars do, with something small. Not a city, not a fleet, not even a king's insult. It began with a single severed human ear. The year was 1731. The setting, the warm contested waters of the Caribbean Sea. There, the great European empires hovered like sharks, circling each other in uneasy peace, trading sugar, rum, and suspicion. Captain Robert Jenkins was one of many British merchants sailing under a flag that promised protection. A fragile piece of cloth in a world filled with cannons and rival flags. His ship, like so many others, was caught in the haze between legality and smuggling, between trade and trespass. When a Spanish patrol boarded Jenkins' ship, they claimed he was violating their territory. They searched his hold, they questioned his men, and then, in a gesture meant to humiliate more than harm, they cut off his ear. They didn't kill him, they didn't destroy the ship. They simply removed one small, soft, unassuming part of his body, and then they handed it back to him, wrapped, as the story goes, in cloth. "Take this to your king," the Spanish officer said, "and tell him what happens to smugglers." Jenkins, to his credit, did exactly that. For years, nothing happened. No war, no uproar. Just a jar, perhaps sitting quietly in a cabinet, waiting. But in 1738, 7 years later, the ear made its return. By then, Britain was looking for a reason. Tensions with Spain had grown. Voices in Parliament were calling for retaliation. And someone remembered the jar. Jenkins appeared before Parliament and presented his ear as evidence. There are no surviving paintings of the moment, but we imagine the room, silent, stiff, powdered wigs turning slowly toward the glass container as he lifted it with trembling hands. It wasn't just about trade anymore. It was about dignity, revenge, empire. And so, in 1739, Britain declared war on Spain. Of course, the official documents listed reasons like violations of navigation rights and disruption of commerce. But to the public, to the sailors, to the headlines in every London paper, it was simply known as the War of Jenkins' Ear. It lasted nearly a decade. Ships burned, forts fell, thousands of men died. And the war eventually folded into a much larger global conflict, the War of the Austrian Succession. But the beginning? A man, a moment, near. And strangely enough, no one knows what happened to that little piece of flesh. Some say it was buried with Jenkins. Others say it was quietly discarded once the war turned serious. But for a time it had power, not just as a symbol but as a spark. History often hides behind grand battles and complex treaties. But sometimes it begins with something small, soft, and strange, like a jar and an ear, floating quietly in Parliament. Number 19. The Flagstaff War. There are objects in history that carry more meaning than their size suggests. Crowns, crosses, coins, and sometimes a flagpole. In the early 19th century, the island of New Zealand stood at a crossroads. The indigenous Maori tribes, proud navigators and warriors with centuries of tradition, were grappling with the growing presence of British colonists. Traders, missionaries, governors, and rules. In 1840, a document was signed, the Treaty of Waitangi. To the British, it marked sovereignty. To many Maori chiefs, it was an agreement of shared governance and mutual respect. But something was lost, not just in translation, but in trust. Within 5 years, that fragile agreement had begun to crack. At the center of the storm was Hone Heke, a chief of great intelligence, pride, and conviction. He had signed the treaty. He had shaken British hands. And now, he regretted it. To Heke, the British were not partners, they were occupiers. They moved the capital, they claimed land. They raised their flag over the town of Kororereka, high above the harbour, on a towering flagstaff driven deep into Maori soil. It wasn't just wood and cloth. To Heke, it was a message, a symbol of who now ruled, and he would not allow it to stand. So, in the quiet of night, with deliberate hands and the weight of generations behind him, Heke cut it down. The British were shocked. They quickly built it again, stronger, taller, firmer, a message of their own. And again, Heke returned and cut it down. Again, 4 times. 4 times he felled the British flagstaff, like a tree that did not belong in his forest. The last time, he didn't just bring an axe, he brought an army. In March of 1845, the town of Kororereka woke to the sounds of cannon fire and musket shots. Heke's warriors attacked from the hills, while another chief, Kawiti, attacked from the north. British soldiers and settlers scrambled to the harbour. Gunpowder stores exploded, homes burned. The Union Jack was pulled down for the final time, and this time, it would not rise again. The British evacuated the town. The Maori burned it to the ground. This was not a full war in the traditional sense. There were no vast battlefields, no epic sieges, just a spark, lit by the refusal to accept the rise of a foreign flag on native land. The British, humiliated, would return months later with reinforcements. The war dragged on for over a year, but the original act, the first silent cut of the flagstaff, had already made its point. Power is not always shown with armies. Sometimes it's a tree falling in the night. Sometimes it's a man with a blade in his hand, looking up at a piece of cloth fluttering in someone else's wind, and in that moment saying, "No more." Number 18. The War of the Golden Stool. Long before the British arrived with maps and muskets, long before treaties were signed and broken, long before they built their forts and flags into the coastlines, there stood a kingdom of order, of rhythm, of legacy. It was not a colony, it was not an extension, it was a nation carved from the wisdom and strength of its own people. It was called Asanteman, the land of the Ashanti. For centuries, the Ashanti built their empire with precision and pride. Gold flowed through their rivers, but it was not gold that made them powerful. It was unity. It was culture. It was a spirit that could not be conquered. And that spirit lived in a stool, not a throne to be occupied, not a seat of vanity or command, but the Sikadwa Kofi, the golden stool, carved from the heavens and guided to earth by the ancestors themselves. To the Ashanti, this stool was not symbolic. It was literal. It held the soul of a Santiman, of all who had ruled, all who lived, and all who were yet to be born. No one sat upon it, not even the Azantehene, the king. He did not own it. He served it. And when the British came, they could not understand. They could conquer land. They could take gold. But they could not measure soul. By 1900, the Ashanti king Prempeh Iaikai had been exiled by British forces. Kumasi had been invaded, but the golden stool remained untouched. They couldn't find it. They never would, unless someone betrayed the spirit of the land. Then came a man named Frederick Hodgson, governor of the Gold Coast, servant of the crown. He stood before Ashanti elders and chiefs in Kumasi, not with humility, but with audacity. And he demanded, "Why am I not sitting on the golden stool?" The air froze. The ancestors listened. No one spoke, because no words were necessary. What he had asked was not political, it was spiritual violence. And so the chiefs left, and a Santaman rose. Thousands of warriors emerged from the forests, driven not by vengeance but by duty, to defend the spirit of their people, their ancestors, their land. They laid siege to the British fort. They cut off supplies. For weeks, colonial soldiers were trapped inside Kumasi, starving, sweating, surrounded. It was a reminder. You may claim our land. You may exile our kings. But without the stool, you have nothing. No power, no permission, no soul. Eventually, British reinforcements broke the siege. Punishments followed. The British called it a victory, but they never found the golden stool, because it had never been theirs to find, carried by loyal hands deep into the forest, shielded by priests and warriors alike. It remained untouched, unseen, but always present. Today, it is still protected in Kumasi, in the kingdom of Asantaman, still sacred. It'll never sat upon, and when a new Asantehene is installed, he kneels before it, not to rule over it, but to be ruled by it. Because in Asantmen, power does not come from crowns. It comes from ancestry. It comes from spirit. Some empires collapse with war, others with silence, and some, like the Ashanti, endure, because they protected the one thing the colonizers could never grasp. What is sacred cannot be stolen. Number 17. The Football War. In the dry heat of Central America, two nations stood divided by history, by land, and eventually, by football. The tension between El Salvador and Honduras didn't begin on a soccer field. It began long before, in the soil, in the borders that bled across maps, in land disputes that stretched back generations, in poverty, migration, and political unrest. By the late 1960s, more than 300,000 Salvadorans were living inside Honduras, many working on farms, many undocumented, many resented. That land reform laws were shifting, Honduran nationalism was rising, and Salvadoran families who had lived there for decades were now being evicted, burned out of homes, pushed off fields, forced to return to a country already strained beyond its limits. Tensions boiled. And then the world did what it often does when it wants to look away from suffering. It turned to sports. In June of 1969, El Salvador and Honduras met in a World Cup qualifying match. What should have been a simple game became something else entirely. The first match was played in Tegucigalpa, the Honduran capital. Honduras won, but the mood was hostile. Fans brawled. Windows shattered. Shouts filled the night. A week later, the second match was held in San Salvador. This time, El Salvador won, and Honduran players had to flee the stadium under military guard. Their hotel was surrounded. The Honduran flag was burned in the streets. Some say a young Salvadoran girl, heartbroken over the loss, took her own life that night, and her funeral was covered in the press as a symbol of national sacrifice. Her coffin was draped in the Salvadoran flag. The country mourned, and something shifted. The third and final match, a decider, was held on neutral ground in Mexico City. El Salvador won again after extra time. But by then the game no longer mattered. Just hours after the final whistle, El Salvador severed diplomatic ties with Honduras. 13 days later, its military crossed the border. The two countries were now at war, not over goals or fouls, but over land, people, and identity. The football matches had been the spark, not the fuel. For 4 days, the two nations fought. Tanks rolled, planes bombed, thousands fled. Civilians paid the price. It would become known as La Guerra del Football, the Football War. By the 5th day, a ceasefire was brokered under pressure from the Organization of American States. The armies pulled back, but nothing had truly ended. Tens of thousands of Salvadorans were now homeless, displaced by violence and rejection. Land reform failed. Tensions simmered for years. The war had no winner, no goals, no trophy, just the tragic reminder that sometimes when wounds run deep, It takes only the whistle of a referee to open them again. And when that happens, a ball is no longer a game. It's a match. Number 16. The Pig War. There are wars that begin with assassinations, with declarations, with flags and armies and maps covered in red. And then there is the war that began with a pig. The year was 1859. The location, San Juan Island, a remote and misty stretch of land nestled between the northwest coast of the United States and the southern tip of British Columbia. At the time, this was disputed territory, claimed by both the United States and Great Britain. Two empires. To one foggy island, no formal border, and one pig too many. On the American side of the island lived Lyman Cutler, a quiet, stubborn farmer from the Oregon Territory. He had carved a homestead from the wilderness, a small cabin, some crops, and a thin slice of peace. His nearest neighbor was an Irishman named Charles Griffin, who worked for the British Hudson's Bay Company. Griffin kept livestock, chickens, sheep, and one particularly bold black pig. The pig had a habit of wandering, and on one grey June morning it wandered again, across a field and into Cutler's garden. There it found fresh potatoes, itself unearthed. Cutler found it rooting through his crops and, furious, shot the pig dead. That should have been the end of it. A neighbourly argument, an apology, maybe some money exchanged. But when Griffin demanded payment and Cutler refused, things escalated. British authorities threatened to arrest Cutler for killing company property. Cutler appealed to the American military, and the Americans responded by sending troops. Soon, 66 US soldiers landed on San Juan Island. The British countered with 5 warships. Cannons were aimed, tents were raised. Both sides dug in. For weeks, the two nations stared each other down over a dead pig. At one point, nearly 500 US soldiers stood opposite more than 2,000 British Marines, both sides under strict orders not to fire first. Guns were loaded, triggers waited, and yet no shot came. The only casualty remained the pig. Back in Washington and London, cooler heads panicked. Neither side wanted a full-scale war over such a ridiculous event, not in a distant colony, not over potatoes and pork. Eventually, both governments agreed to a joint military occupation of the island, an arrangement that lasted 12 years. British soldiers set up camp on the North Shore. American soldiers held the South. They drilled, they watched, and over time, they began to befriend each other. They played cards. They shared stories. They even held joint 4th of July celebrations, lighting fireworks over the disputed land. A war that never was, slowly became a campfire tale. In 1872, the dispute was settled peacefully through arbitration by Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany, who ruled in favor of the United States. The British withdrew. The Americans stayed, and the pig, the one who started it all, was forgotten. There is no statue of it, no plaque, no grave. Just a small, quiet field on San Juan Island where a hungry animal once crossed an invisible line and nearly triggered a war between two global powers. Sometimes, history turns on a king's ambition. Other times, it turns on a pig's appetite. Number 15. The Stray Dog War. Borders are strange things. Invisible lines, drawn by men, often in rooms far from the lands they divide. Lines that can split rivers, families, hills, even the path of a wandering dog. In the autumn of 1925, a Greek soldier stood near the border between Greece and Bulgaria. It was quiet. Tense. The kind of quiet that only exists between two countries that had fought too recently and forgiven too little. The soldier was not looking for trouble. He was watching his dog. No one remembers the dog's name. It may have been a shepherd's dog, loyal, scrappy, used to wide open fields. But what it wasn't used to was borders. Something caught the dog's attention. A scent, a sound, a shadow, and it bolted. It ran past the soldier, across the field and into Bulgarian territory. The soldier did what any dog owner would do. He followed. He crossed the border without a thought, not with a weapon drawn, not in anger, but in instinct. And then, gunfire. The Bulgarian guards spotted a Greek soldier entering their land, and they shot him. Within hours, word reached the Greek commanders. Their man had been killed, unarmed, chasing a dog. The reaction was immediate. Greece mobilized its army. Troops were ordered into Bulgaria. Tanks rolled. Artillery was placed. And within days, Greece had invaded a Bulgarian town called Petrich. It was not a large invasion. It wasn't meant to be a full war. But for the people of Petrich, it was real. Civilians fled. Bishops were looted. Bullets cracked the air over a town that had not asked to be a battlefield. Bulgaria, caught off guard, appealed to the League of Nations. They claimed they had acted in defense. They called the incident a misunderstanding, a tragedy, not a provocation. The League moved quickly. Perhaps for once, the great experiment in diplomacy would prove useful. A ceasefire was called. Greece was ordered to withdraw and pay compensation. And to the surprise of many, they did. The occupation ended after just 10 days. No treaty was signed. No peace was celebrated. To silence, and a dog that never came back. The incident became known, almost mockingly, as the War of the Stray Dog. Best. But beneath its absurdity lies something darker, a reminder of how fragile peace can be, how quickly nations can unravel, how a single step across a line, by man or beast, can awaken old wounds. We don't know what happened to the soldier's dog. Did it keep running? Was it captured, or killed, or adopted by someone who never knew what it started? We'll never know. But in the annals of human conflict, its place remains. Not as a soldier, not as a hero, but as a stray who crossed a border and nearly pulled 2 nations into war behind it. Number 14. The Pastry War. Wars are often sparked by territory, religion, gold, or revenge. But in the 19th century, in a cafe tucked away in Mexico City, a war began over a dessert. It was 1828 when the trouble first began, long before the cannons fired, long before the ships arrived. A French pastry chef named Monsieur Rimontel ran a small bakery in a quiet district of the city. He was an immigrant, a craftsman, and like so many others, he had left Europe to seek opportunity in the New World. But Mexico, newly independent from Spain, was still raw with unrest. The capital swayed between governments. Soldiers roamed the streets. Or in the rule of law, when it arrived at all, came late and incomplete. One day, a riot broke out near Rimontel's bakery. Whether it was political or personal, no one recalls. But what is remembered is what was left behind. A shattered storefront, smashed windows, destroyed ovens, and rows of perfectly formed pastries crushed under boot and flame. Rimontel, outraged and financially ruined, did what he could. He demanded compensation from the Mexican government for his shop, his ovens, his lost pastries, but they refused. To them, he was just one man in a city full of problems. A baker, not a diplomat. Foreigner, not a priority. So he appealed to his homeland. He wrote to the French government and demanded 60,000 pesos, an astronomical amount for a baker's shop in that time, an amount that far exceeded the cost of what he had lost. Strangely, France agreed. Not only did they take up his cause, they used it as an excuse. For years, France had been looking for a reason to pressure Mexico. French merchants claimed to have been mistreated. Loans had gone unpaid. The pastry chef's complaint was just absurd enough to be useful, a small injustice they could inflate into a national insult. In 1838, nearly a decade after Rimontel's bakery was destroyed, France sent a fleet of warships to the Mexican coast. They blockaded the ports. They demanded compensation. And when Mexico refused, the French opened fire. Fortresses were shelled. Trade routes were cut off. Cities trembled under the weight of European artillery. And all of it officially was over a pastry shop. The conflict would last months. The Mexican forces, under the legendary General Santa Anna, resisted fiercely. In battle, Santa Anna lost a leg to cannon fire, a wound he would later turn into political theatre, burying the limb with full military honours and displaying the prosthetic in parades. Eventually, under mounting pressure and damage to its economy, Mexico agreed to pay the 600,000 pesos that France demanded, not just for Remontel, but for other French nationals who had filed grievances. France withdrew. The cannons fell silent. The bakery, long since reduced to ash, was never rebuilt. And Remontel, the man whose pastries caused a war, vanished from history. His name remains in the records, but there are no statues, no tributes, just a strange, quiet footnote. A war begun by butter, sugar, and shattered glass. But behind the absurdity, there is something real. A reminder of how small stories can be twisted by large powers. How the complaints of a single man can echo across oceans, when nations are hungry for reasons. And how sometimes the fate of thousands can turn on the crumble of a tart. Number 13. The Lijar War on France. In the grand sweep of military history, most wars are fought by nations with armies, generals, and complex geopolitics. But every so often, a war is declared not by a government, but by pride. Not by a capital, but by a village. And not with guns or swords, but with words. And the stubborn refusal to feel small. The year was 1883. The place, Lijar, a tiny village nestled in the dry hills of Andalusia, southern Spain. It was a humble town, quiet, dusty, overlooked. No palace, no garrison, no wealth. Just whitewashed homes, olive groves, and a community of proud, tough people who had survived centuries of empire and invasion. At the same time, across the Pyrenees, Spain's neighbour France was basking in national pride. Their president, Jules Grevy, was scheduled to welcome King Alfonso XII of Spain during a state visit to Paris. A gesture meant to smooth old rivalries. But as Alfonso's carriage moved through the French capital, something happened. We don't know who started it. Perhaps it was a student, or a nationalist, or simply someone drunk on patriotism. But the Spanish king was insulted, booed, jeered at, and humiliated in public view. French officials dismissed it as a minor disturbance. Spanish newspapers were outraged. But for the people of Lijar, it was personal. To insult the king was to insult Spain. To insult Spain was to insult Lijar. So the village council held an emergency session. The mayor, a man named Miguel Garcia Salles, stood before the townspeople and made it official. France has dishonored the dignity of our nation and our monarch. We, the people of Lijar, declare war upon the French Republic. And just like that, a town with no army, no weapons, and no navy was at war with France. They wrote it down, signed it, and published it. Their declaration made local papers. And though France never responded, the people of Lijar stood firm. For 93 years, this war remained official. There were no battles, no shots fired, no casualties. The French continued, blissfully unaware that a tiny Andalusian village considered them enemies of the state. Children were raised on the story. Tourists chuckled at the tale. But for the villagers, it was never a joke. It was about dignity. It was about not being ignored. And in 1976, nearly a century later, with France now an ally, the Lijar Town Council held another solemn meeting and voted to declare peace. A ceremony was held. Hands were shaken. The war, which had been entirely symbolic, was finally over. But in that long silence between declaration and peace, Lijar had done something extraordinary. They had reminded the world that you don't need cannons to declare yourself sovereign. You don't need soldiers to hold your ground. And even a forgotten town with no battlefield to stand on can raise its voice and say, "We matter." Not every war is fought for conquest. Some are fought to be heard. Number 12. The War of the Oaken Bucket. In the medieval city-states of Italy, pride was as precious as gold. It shaped alliances, destroyed friendships, and carved deep wounds into the stone of history. But of all the things that have been fought over, land, religion, power, few are stranger than what sparked a full-scale war between Bologna and Modena in the year 1325. It was not a castle, not a crown, not a priceless artifact. It was a bucket, an oaken bucket to be precise, ordinary in shape, roughly carved, its staves held together by iron bands. A humble vessel for drawing water from a city well. But in the fractured, tense politics of medieval Italy, it was enough. The two cities had long been rivals. Modena, backed by the Ghibellines, supported the Holy Roman Emperor. Bologna, loyal to the Guelphs, supported the Pope. These weren't just distant allegiances, they were defining identities, tribal affiliations that turned neighbors into enemies. For decades, the two cities had stared at each other across disputed borders, each waiting for the other to make the first move. And then, one night, so the story goes, a group of Modenese soldiers crept into Bologna on a covert raid. They didn't sack the city. They didn't assassinate a leader. They didn't poison a well. They stole a bucket. Some say it was taken from the main town well. Others claim it came from a military barracks. But what matters is this: it was Bolognese. And now it stood, proudly displayed in Modena, a trophy of humiliation, a public insult, a declaration of superiority in the form of firewood and water. Bologna demanded its return. Modena refused. And in a world where honor mattered more than reason, that refusal meant war. The armies assembled, armored knights, crossbowmen, cavalry, and infantry. Over 30,000 men drawn from across the region. On November 15th and 1325, they met in battle at a place called Zappolino, a rolling plain between the two cities, stained red by the clash of ancient grievances. Despite being outnumbered, the Modenese were better organized. They crushed the Bolognese force. The battle was brutal, short, and decisive. Some say over 2,000 men died that day, all for a bucket that could barely hold a gallon of water. After the victory, Modena did not stop at the battlefield. They marched all the way to the gates of Bologna, murked the defeated city, and replaced its city well with their own water, as if to say, you can't even draw your own. And the bucket, they kept it, not hidden, not buried, but enshrined in the Torre della Ghirlandina, a bell tower in Modena, where it still remains to this day. Visitors can go and see it. A plain wooden bucket, now nearly 700 years old, displayed like a sacred relic. And maybe it is, because in that small object, we find the absurdity of human pride, how easily we're drawn to violence, how quickly honor can outweigh reason, and how two great cities could burn for a vessel made to carry water. Not blood. There are greater wars, more tragic ones. But few remind us quite so clearly that sometimes all it takes is a bucket. Number 11. The Pemmican War. In the sweeping plains and frozen rivers of early 19th century Canada. Before the railroads, before the provinces, before the name Canada meant anything unified, the land was shaped by commerce, and commerce was shaped by fur. Pelts were gold in the eyes of European traders. Beaver, otter, fox. Their hides were hunted, packed, and sold across oceans. And at the center of this booming industry were two rival companies. The Hudson's Bay Company, old, royal chartered, and well-established, and the upstart Northwest Company, more aggressive, more ambitious, and not at all interested in playing second fiddle. The two companies hated each other. They competed for territory, indigenous alliances, and supply routes. Their fur posts were often built within miles of one another, each a wooden fortress flying a different flag, hiring scouts, trappers, and armed guards. And in the heart of this Cold War stood a strange, humble object, pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries. Pemmican was the perfect frontier food. It lasted for months. It fed voyageurs on long canoe journeys. It sustained fur brigades deep in the wilderness. It was fuel not just for bodies but for entire trading operations. So when the governor of the Hudson's Bay Company, controlled Red River Colony, passed a law banning the export of pemmican, he wasn't just protecting local food. He was starving the competition. The Northwest Company was furious. Their supply chains were cut off. Their men began to go hungry. Their profits and pride began to wither. Tensions rose. Forts were raided. Supply boats were intercepted. Men on both sides began arming themselves for more than just hunting. Then came 1816, and with it, the tipping point. A group of Northwest Company Métis fighters, led by Cuthbert Grant, encountered a detachment of Red River settlers and soldiers near Seven Oaks, just outside what is now Winnipeg. The settlers, it's unclear who fired first, but within minutes, gunshots echoed across the prairie. When it was over, 21 settlers lay dead, including their governor, Robert Semple. The Métis lost just one man. It was not a battle between armies. It was a clash between settlers and traders, between empire and livelihood, between colonial power and the people who knew the land best. The event shocked Britain. The Hudson's Bay Company called it a massacre. The Northwest Company claimed it was self-defense. In the years that followed, violence continued. Not in great battles, but in skirmishes, raids, legal disputes, and power plays. It wasn't until 1821 that London forced the two companies to merge, ending the rivalry not with a treaty, but with a business deal. The Pemmican War faded from textbooks, overshadowed by larger wars, buried under maps and treaties. But beneath it all was a lesson that even the most ridiculous-seeming wars, like one over a pouch of dried meat, can reveal deeper truths about power, and about survival, and about how, in the wilderness of colonial ambition, food is never just food. It is control. It is life. It is war. Number 10. The Battle of Caransebes. It is one thing to lose a battle. It is another to lose it. To yourself. History is filled with military disasters, retreats, ambushes, blunders. But few compare to what happened on a dark night in 1788 in a sleepy town called Caransebes in what is now modern-day Romania. At the time, it belonged to the Habsburg monarchy, and its fields were packed with soldiers preparing for war against the Ottoman Empire. Tens of thousands of troops from across the Austrian Empire had gathered there. Germans, Hungarians, Italians, Croats, all speaking different languages, wearing different uniforms and answering to a chain of command that barely held together. They were nervous, tired, and far from home. And most of all, they were waiting for the Ottomans, who hadn't yet arrived. So the soldiers did what idle armies often do. They drank. That evening, a scouting party of Austrian hussars, light cavalry, crossed the river to check for Ottoman presence. They found nothing threatening, but they did find a group of gypsies selling barrels of schnapps. Delighted, they bought the liquor and hauled it back to camp. But when the infantry saw what the hussars were doing, they wanted in. They demanded the schnapps. The hussars refused. A fight broke out. First verbal, then physical, and finally, with weapons. Shots were fired. In the confusion, someone screamed, "Turks! The Turks are attacking!" Panic exploded across the camp. Soldiers ran in all directions. Others, hearing the gunfire and shouts, assumed the Ottomans were upon them. Officers ordered defensive positions. Cannons were fired in the dark at nothing. Entire regiments began firing on each other, mistaking allies for enemies. Some soldiers even fled across the river and drowned. The next morning, when the sun rose over the muddy battlefield, no enemy bodies were found. Because there had been no enemy, only Austrians, hundreds of them, dead or wounded, killed by their own side. And when the Ottoman army did finally arrive 2 days later, they found the Austrian camp already broken and in retreat. There are no glorious monuments to Caransebes, no medals awarded, only scattered mentions in military archives and the lingering sting of embarrassment. It may be the only battle in history where a side managed to defeat itself so thoroughly that the enemy simply walked in afterward and claimed the field. Some say it's a legend, exaggerated over time. But contemporary records do exist, vague, ashamed, and incomplete. Because no general wants to write down, we drank too much and shot ourselves. But if it happened, and many believe it did, then the Battle of Karansebe stands as one of the most absurd failures of coordination, communication, and calm in military history. A reminder that fear, once released, can be just as deadly as any sword or cannon. And sometimes, the greatest threat to an army is itself. Number 9. The Hatfield-McCoy feud. Not all wars are fought by nations. Some are fought by families, not over treaties, or borders, or gold, but over pride, blood, and a pig. In the tangled hills of Appalachia, where the rivers carve narrow valleys between steep, forested ridges, there lived two clans whose names would become legend: the Hatfields of West Virginia and the McCoys of Kentucky. The roots of their feud trace back to the American Civil War, when loyalties were divided and old tensions hardened into something colder. But the war ended, and the bitterness didn't. What followed was not one clear conflict, but a slow boiling storm of insults, lawsuits, beatings, court battles, and death. A kind of war that didn't begin with a bang, but with a grunt. In 1878, a McCoy man accused a Hatfield cousin of stealing his hog. It was a serious accusation in the poverty-stricken hills. A hog could feed a family for weeks. The case went to court. The judge was a Hatfield. The witness was a Hatfield. The verdict? Not guilty. And just like that, the blood began to simmer. In the years that followed, violence escalated. A forbidden romance bloomed between Rosanna McCoy and John C. Hatfield. A story straight out of Shakespeare, but with moonshine and rifles. She became pregnant. He abandoned her.
Her family was outraged. So were his. Retaliations followed. Shootings in the dark. Beatings in broad daylight. Legal cases that were overturned, appealed, or ignored entirely. By 1882, the fuse had burned down to powder. A McCoy stabbed A. Hatfield in a drunken brawl. In revenge, Double Anse Hatfield, the clan's feared patriarch, ordered 3 McCoys to be tied to pawpaw bushes and executed by firing squad. The line between feud and war was gone. The turning point came in 1888 when the Hatfields raided the McCoy cabin on New Year's Day, setting it ablaze and killing 2 of the McCoy children as they fled the flames. America took notice. Newspapers began printing the story across the country. Rural vengeance, backwoods bloodshed, frontier lawlessness. Governors got involved. Militias were called up. Eventually, the feud became a case for the U.S. Supreme Court. Trials were held. Some Hatfields were sentenced to life. One was hanged. The violence finally slowed, but it never quite vanished. It has held the echoes for decades. Today, the descendants of the Hatfields and McCoys live in peace. Some run businesses together. There are festivals, reenactments, even joint family reunions. In 2003, they symbolically signed a truce, 115 years after the worst of the violence, but the feud has become more than history. It's a myth, a symbol, a cautionary tale of how generational pride, once wounded, can bleed for lifetimes. Not every war needs an army. Sometimes it only takes a rumor, a pig, a broken heart, and 2 families, too proud to stop.
Number 8. The War of the Whiskers. There are times when history blends with legend, when truth is wrapped in ritual, and the past begins to sound like a parable. Such is the case with the so-called War of the Whiskers, a conflict so strange, so oddly specific, and historians still debate whether it was real, exaggerated, or simply too ridiculous to forget. The setting is ancient Egypt, not during the time of pyramids and pharaohs, but in a later period when foreign powers loomed, and the priesthood clung tightly to what remained of tradition and power. In this era, the appearance of a high priest was not a matter of vanity. It was sacred. The robes, the rings, the golden sandals all carried meaning, but above all else, the beard. Egyptian priests, especially those of higher rank, wore artificial beards made of braided linen or goat hair, stiffened with beeswax and often tied with golden cords behind the ears. They were meant to evoke the gods, immortal beings who, in carvings and statues, were always shown with majestic pointed beards. To touch one's beard in ceremony was to invoke divine order. To wear it wrong was an insult to the divine. And so, in a time when two powerful priestly factions began to drift apart, one favouring traditional grooming, the other pushing for shorter, simpler styles, that stage was set for one of the most absurd divisions in ancient religious life. Some sources, half-whispers in temple archives, commentaries scribbled by later Greek visitors, describe a sudden and dramatic fallout between the two sects. One group accused the other of blasphemy. They claimed their opponents were trimming the sacred whiskers too short. Others claimed their rivals were using foreign wax, imported from Phoenicia, unblessed and impure. Insults followed. So did denunciations. Temples were barred. Ceremonies were duplicated, one with the long curling whiskers of the old gods, and one with the trimmed modernized beards of reform. What started as grooming preferences soon turned violent. Priests clashed in processions. A sacred festival ended in a brawl beside the Nile. Scrolls were seized, altars defaced. In one dramatic account, an opposing group of priests is said to have shaved off the whiskers of their rivals during a nighttime raid. A symbolic gesture so shameful it echoed like heresy across the land. Whether it escalated into full warfare, soldiers' armies' death, is debated. But what is known is that temples were closed, ceremonies suspended, and for a time, the spiritual heart of Egypt trembled because of facial hair, and though the feud eventually faded, either by royal decree, mutual exhaustion, or quiet compromise, the story survived. Not because it was grand, but because it was ridiculous. Today it reads like satire, but beneath the absurdity lies a very human truth. We tie our identity to symbols, to clothing, to language, to rituals, and yes, to hair. And when those symbols are threatened, even the most sacred societies can fall into chaos. So whether or not the War of the Whiskers happened exactly as told, its lesson remains that sometimes, in the heat of belief, even gods can be argued over in front of a mirror, with a comb in one hand and a blade in the other. Number 7. The rebellion of the chamber pots. There are revolts sparked by famine, by oppression, by revolutionaries standing on barricades, shouting slogans of liberty and justice. And then there are revolts sparked by toilets, or more precisely, by the vessels people used before toilets existed. This is the strange tale of Brazil, sometime in the late 19th century. A country freshly freed from the chains of monarchy, grappling with its new identity as a republic, and trying desperately to modernize in the eyes of Europe. But while the government in Rio de Janeiro focused on railroads, banks, and foreign diplomacy, the common people of the city had a much more personal concern: where to do their business and what it would cost them. Before modern plumbing became widespread, most Brazilians, rich or poor, relied on chamber pots. Simple bowls or vessels made of clay, tin, or porcelain, used at night and emptied in the morning. They were private objects, but also strangely decorative, a quiet symbol of household status. Wealthier families imported theirs from Europe, intricately painted, often bearing floral designs or delicate patterns. And then, suddenly, that wasn't allowed. The new Brazilian Republic, seeking to reduce foreign imports and boost domestic manufacturing, passed a sweeping tax reform law. Among its many stipulations was a hefty new tariff on imported ceramic goods, including chamber pots. Overnight, what had been a mundane household item became a luxury tax target. Prices soared. Merchants protested. Households that once prided themselves on having a fine French or English pot were now forced to choose between paying triple or using rough domestic models that chipped and leaked. The backlash came quickly. Newspapers mocked the policy. Editorials with titles like "A Nation Built on Broken Pots" began to circulate. Citizens took to the streets in protest, carrying their chamber pots like banners. Some painted slogans on them, others banged them like drums. One man, according to local accounts, stood atop a soapbox and declared, "Belly tax our dignity, they tax our waste. What next? A toll to breathe?" The protests grew. They were chaotic, colourful, absurd, but they weren't entirely peaceful. Shops were vandalised. Government buildings had pots hurled at them. A ceramic importer's warehouse was set ablaze. Dozens of crates of English mad chamber pots shattered in the flames. Though the government downplayed the violence, they were rattled. No one wanted to be remembered as the regime that lost power over the price of poop. Eventually, the tariff was quietly revised. Domestic manufacturers received subsidies. Imported pots returned, not as symbols of revolution, but as reminders of a brief, ridiculous period of unrest. Today, few Brazilians remember the details. It's a footnote in economic policy, a joke whispered among historians. But the rebellion of the chamber pots stands as a strange little mirror, reflecting the truth that governments, however mighty, you can still be brought low by the little things in life. Because while politics may live in marble halls and gilded parlours, reality, who lives in the corner of the bedroom, beneath a ceramic lid. Number 6. The 335 Years' War. Some wars are known for their brutality, others for their battles, and some, like this one, for lasting so long, you'd be forgiven for thinking they were simply forgotten. This is the story of a war that spanned 3 centuries. A war with no battles, no bloodshed, and no casualties. A war so quiet, so absurd that no one even remembered it was happening. The year was 1651. The English Civil War had torn the British Isles apart. King Charles I had been executed. His son, Charles II, fled to the continent. The monarchy had collapsed, and the parliamentarians, led by Oliver Cromwell, now held power. Charles II, desperate to rally support for his claim to the throne, turned to the Netherlands for help. In return, Dutch ships began attacking English positions, including those near the remote, wind-swept islands off the coast of Cornwall, known as the Isles of Scilly. The Isles were loyal to the Royalists, the side that would ultimately lose. They were small, sparsely populated, and of little strategic value, but they had chosen a side, and in war that was enough. In response to Dutch losses at sea, Admiral Martin Tromp, commanding the Dutch fleet, sailed to Scilly in 1651 and demanded reparations. The Royalists refused, and so, in a flourish of bureaucratic formality, the Netherlands declared war on the Isles of Scilly. That was it. No ships attacked. No guns were fired. The war existed only on paper, an empty gesture from one corner of Europe to a scattering of stormy rocks on the edge of the Atlantic. Weeks later, the Royalists on Scilly surrendered. The Dutch fleet sailed away. The war, in practice, was over, but it had never been officially ended. No treaty was signed. No agreement was drafted. And so, like a forgotten candle burning in an empty room, the war continued. Generations passed. Centuries rolled on. Empires rose and fell. The United Kingdom and the Netherlands fought other wars, signed new treaties, joined international organizations, but none of them addressed the tiny, ridiculous declaration made in 1651. And then, in 1986, a curious historian named Roy Duncan, who also happened to be the chairman of the Isles of Scilly Council, discovered the truth. The Isles were still technically at war with the Netherlands. Amused and mildly alarmed, Duncan contacted the Dutch embassy. Diplomats double-checked their archives. And yes, it was true. 335 years later, in a small ceremony filled with handshakes and polite chuckles, the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly signed a peace treaty, finally ending the longest and most peaceful war in human history. There were no parades, no medals, just a few smiles, a newspaper article or two, and a shared sense of embarrassment and delight. But beneath the humour is a deeper truth, that sometimes wars are not ended by cannon fire or surrender, but simply forgotten. lost between pages, overshadowed by greater conflicts, waiting, quietly, for someone to remember that peace was never signed. And when they finally do, the war ends not with a bang, but with a pen. Number 5. The Flagstaff War. In the lush, mist-covered hills of northern New Zealand, where green mountains touch the sea and ancient trees whisper in the wind, the war once began not with a battle cry, but with the sound of an axe biting into wood. This was not just any tree, not just any pole. It was a flagstaff, a tall wooden mast planted by the British, from which the Union Jack flew high above the town of Kororeka. The year was 1845. The British had only recently arrived in force. Just 5 years earlier, they had signed the Treaty of Waitangi, an agreement between the British Crown and dozens of Maori chiefs, one meant to ensure protection and partnership. But almost from the moment the ink dried, it became clear the treaty was not being honoured equally. The British claimed sovereignty. They moved the capital. They enforced laws that the Maori had never agreed to. Land was taken. Power shifted. And for many Maori, especially the powerful Mugapui tribe in the north, it became clear that the treaty had not brought peace. It had brought occupation. At the centre of this growing resentment stood a single man, Oneheke, a chief, a warrior, a thinker, and one of the first to sign the Treaty of Waitangi. But now he saw the truth, that British promises were hollow, that his people's mana, their authority, their dignity, was being eroded by every new law, every new settler, and every time that flag waved in the wind. So he made a decision. Quietly, deliberately, he cut down the flagstaff. The British were stunned. He re-erected it, stronger than before. Heke waited. Then he returned and cut it down again. 3 more times the pattern repeated. The British raised the flag, and Heke felled it like a tree. But the 4th time, he didn't come alone. On the 11th of March 1845, as the sun rose over the harbour, Heke's warriors launched a coordinated attack on the town of Kororeka. From the hills they descended with muskets and blades. British settlers and soldiers scrambled to defend the garrison. Explosions shook the town. Flames devoured wooden homes. Women and children were rushed to ships in the harbour. By the end of the day, the Union Jack had fallen. The British abandoned the town, and Honeheke stood once again over the remains of the flagstaff, victorious, but not finished. What followed was a year-long conflict known as the Northern War, or more famously, the Flagstaff War, a series of battles, sieges, and ambushes between British forces and the united Maori warriors of the north. One of the most famous Maori fortresses, Puketutu, held strong against British artillery. In another, Oehaeawi, the Maori used advanced trench systems and deceptive tactics to repel their enemies. The British, shocked by Maori resistance and ingenuity, were forced to retreat multiple times. Eventually, a stalemate settled over the land. Neither side could fully claim victory, but the British never rebuilt the flagstaff. Not until years later, and only with the blessing of the Maori. Today, a new flagstaff stands on that same hill in Russell. Once called Kororeka, it flies not just the Union Jack, but also the Maori flag and the flag of the United Tribes of New Zealand, symbols of a history that still shapes the country today. And Honeheke, he is remembered not as a rebel, but as a man who demanded to be heard, a man who looked up at a foreign flag fluttering over his land and said, "Not here, not like this. Some wars are fought for empires. Others are fought for pride. But this one was fought for dignity, carved into wood, cut down with honor, and still standing in memory." Number 4. The War of the Cow. The year was 1272, and Europe was as fragile as it was feudal. Castles dotted the hillsides like jagged teeth. Knights rode under the banners of dukes and counts, each vying for land, loyalty, and legacy. And in the region of Flanders, near the border of what is now Belgium and northern France, one small incident was about to spiral into one very bloody war. It started, as absurd wars often do, with a single cow. In the town of Binch, a local peasant found his prize cow had wandered off. After searching the surrounding fields, he discovered it, tied up in the neighbouring town of Warbach, across the border in the territory of the Prince Bishopric of Liège. The townspeople of Warbach claimed it as their own. The peasant insisted it was his. An argument followed, harsh words, then fists, then blades. And before anyone could cool down, the dispute between two men over one cow became a matter of town honour. And town honour in the Middle Ages was a dangerous thing. The local lord of Binch backed his peasant. The magistrates of Warbach defended their citizen. And soon letters were sent, alliances called, and the nobility on both sides took up arms. Not for land, or law, or religion, but to avenge a cow's custody. It sounds like satire, but it was real. Thousands of soldiers were raised. Knights marched under banners of vengeance and fealty. And before the summer ended, the armies clashed. The largest battle took place near Saintes, and it was a bloodbath. Estimates vary, but some chronicles claim that over 15,000 men were killed during the conflict. All from a war sparked by one livestock dispute. The violence didn't stop there. Retaliations swept through the countryside. Villages were burned. Crops were trampled. Churches were looted as soldiers from both sides sought to punish anyone remotely connected to the opposing faction. The cow, the animal itself, likely died early in the conflict, either butchered by its captors or lost amid the chaos it had unintentionally unleashed. No treaty could undo the damage. Eventually the war burned itself out, not with peace, but with exhaustion. The War of the Cow faded into local legend, retold as a fable, a joke, an absurdity. But beneath its ridiculous surface is something darker, a reminder of how quickly human pride escalates. How easy it is to shed blood for principle, even when that principle is wrapped in something as ordinary as a rope tied to a cow's neck. In a world where dignity mattered more than reason, the cow was not just an animal. It was property. It was a symbol. It was a spark. And that spark lit a fire that burned through fields, families, and faith, long after the cow itself was gone. Number 3. The Bassoes' War. Some wars are long, some are bitter, and some are so absurd in origin, you'd swear they were made up by poets. But in the deserts of ancient Arabia, long before Islam, before oil, before nations had names, there were tribes, and among those tribes, a camel died. And that is what started a 40-year war. This happened around the 5th century. Two powerful clans, the Taghlib and the Bak, shared land, marriages, and uneasy peace. A woman named Albasus, from the Bak tribe, was visiting her niece, who was married into the Taghlib. She brought with her a prized camel, sleek, well-fed, marked as hers. But Albasus was nervous. The tribal customs of hospitality were complex, and she felt unwelcome. So she did something small, perhaps even passive-aggressive. She let her camel graze without permission in the Taghlib pasture. The next morning, a Taghlib chief named Jassas ibn Murrah saw the foreign animal and shot it dead. It could have ended there. An apology, payment of blood money, as was customary, a simple ritual to smooth the sand. But Albasus was furious. She wailed. She tore her robes. She screamed that she had been dishonored, not by the killing of the camel, but by the insult of it. Her nephew, Kulayb, the ruler of the Taghlib and one of the most feared warriors in Arabia, he refused to apologize. Honor had been breached. Words turned to blades, and suddenly 2 tribes with centuries of shared ancestry were at war. For 40 years they fought. Generations were born into the war and died without seeing peace. Sons avenged fathers. Fathers avenged brothers. Songs were written. Oaths were sworn. It wasn't just battles. It was poetry, grief, and rage wrapped together in tribal pride. Every death required vengeance. Every slight festered. The war outlasted most of its original participants. No one remembered the camel's name. But the Basu's War, named after the old woman who cried for it, became legend. Eventually the tribes grew weary. The sands were soaked with enough blood. The war faded. Not with a treaty, but with exhaustion. It remains one of the longest feuds in Arab history, and one of the most absurd in its origin, because it wasn't really about the camel. It was about honor, and the lengths we'll go to protect it, even if it means tearing everything else down. Number 2. The Battle of Karansebes. It is one thing to lose a battle. It is another to lose it, to yourself. History is filled with military disasters, retreats, ambushes, blunders, but few compare to what happened on a dark night in 1788 in a sleepy town called Karansebes in what is now modern-day Romania. At the time, it belonged to the Habsburg monarchy, and its fields were packed with soldiers preparing for war against the Ottoman Empire. Tens of thousands of troops from across the Austrian Empire had gathered there. Germans, Hungarians, Italians, Croats, all speaking different languages, wearing different uniforms, and answering to a chain of command that barely held together. They were nervous, tired, and far from home. And most of all, they were waiting for the Ottomans, who hadn't yet arrived. So the soldiers did what idle armies often do. They drank. That evening, a scouting party of Austrian hussars, light cavalry, crossed the river to check for Ottoman presence. They found nothing threatening, but they did find a group of gypsies selling barrels of schnapps. Delighted, they bought the liquor and hauled it back to camp. But when the infantry saw what the hussars were doing, they wanted in. They demanded the schnapps. The hussars refused. A fight broke out, first verbal, then physical, and finally with weapons. Shots were fired. In the confusion, someone screamed, "Turks! The Turks are attacking!" Panic exploded across the camp. Soldiers ran in all directions. Others, hearing the gunfire and shouts, assumed the Ottomans were upon them. Officers ordered defensive positions. Cannons were fired in the dark at nothing. Entire regiments began firing on each other, mistaking allies for enemies. Some soldiers even fled across the river and drowned. The next morning, when the sun rose over the muddy battlefield, no enemy bodies were found, because there had been no enemy. Only Austrians, hundreds of them, dead or wounded, killed by their own side. And when the Ottoman army did finally arrive 2 days later, they found the Austrian camp already broken and in retreat. There are no glorious monuments to Karansebes, no medals awarded, and only scattered mentions in military archives and the lingering sting of embarrassment. It may be the only battle in history where a side managed to defeat itself so thoroughly that the enemy simply walked in afterward and claimed the field. Some say it's a legend, exaggerated over time, but contemporary records do exist, vague, ashamed, and incomplete, because no general wants to write down, "We drank too much and shot ourselves." But if it happened, and many believe it did, then the Battle of Karansebes stands as one of the most absurd failures of coordination, communication, and calm in military history. A reminder that fear, once released, can be just as deadly as any sword or cannon, and sometimes the greatest threat to an army is itself. Number 1. The Great Emu War. Australia, 1932. A nation still catching its breath after the Great War. Soldiers had returned to a country unfamiliar, uncertain. The government, in a gesture meant to reward their sacrifice, gave them land in the vast, dry heart of Western Australia. Stretches of wind-battered soil, lonely farms far from cities, rail lines or rain. These new farmers planted wheat. They built fences. They waited for the promised subsidies that never came. And then, one spring, the earth began to move. It wasn't a dust storm. It wasn't thunder. It was something stranger. Tens of thousands of emus, great flightless birds, standing 2 meters tall, with legs like steel springs and necks that twisted like serpents, began to appear on the horizon. They moved in herds, hundreds at a time, each one capable of outrunning a galloping horse, each one indifferent to fences, warnings, or bullets. What began as curiosity soon became a crisis. The emus invaded the wheat fields, trampling young stalks, snapping fence posts, destroying months of labor in minutes. The farmers panicked. They tried everything. Fire, dogs, traps. Nothing worked. So they wrote letters. They called officials. And finally, someone listened. The government gave an order. Send the army. In November of 1932, Major G.P. Petty Meredith arrived in Western Australia with a team of soldiers, 2 Lewis machine guns, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The mission was simple: remove the emus, restore the land, end the chaos. The farmers cheered. The soldiers prepared. And on the 2nd of November, they opened fire. The birds scattered instantly. What had looked like a slow-moving herd suddenly became a blur of motion. The emus split into small, fast-moving groups, darting through scrub and brush like they knew the terrain better than any map. The soldiers gave chase. But the terrain was rough. The guns jammed. The trucks couldn't keep up. They fired hundreds of rounds. Only a few birds fell. By day 3, morale was slipping. The emus had learned. They began to use decoys. One bird would draw fire while the others ran, and some flocks developed lookouts. One soldier later claimed, "The village birds have a kind of military organization," and perhaps they did. After a week, the army had fired over 2,500 bullets and killed fewer than 200 emus. The operation was paused. The press got wind of it. Headlines spread. Use maneuver troops. Australian army fails to beat birds. Farmers begged for reinforcements. So the government sent the soldiers back. They tried again. They set ambushes. They mounted guns on trucks. They even tried synchronized attacks. But nothing worked. The birds were too fast, too agile, too many. And after nearly 2 months, the operation was quietly ended. The emus remained. No medals were given. No victory declared. Just an awkward silence and the slow realization that one of the largest land armies in the world had lost a campaign to a bird. Today, the Great Emu War is remembered not as a tragedy, but as a warning. Not everything that disrupts order is an enemy. Not every problem can be solved with bullets. And sometimes, the harder you push, the faster things scatter. The farmers were left to rebuild. The birds kept migrating. And in the red dirt of Western Australia, the story lives on. Part history, part legend. A quiet monument to military pride, beaten by feathers. And if you're still awake or barely holding on to consciousness, then you've just survived. The top 20 most ridiculous wars in human history. We've seen pastries become causes for invasion, sheep targeted by nerve gas, and empires brought to their knees by birds and buckets. Because in the end, the human obsession with honor, territory, and pride is often no match for chaos, coincidence, or a single camel. If you enjoyed this journey, leave a comment below telling us which war shocked you most. And if you're listening in the dark, just know you're not the only one. Still wondering what happened to that golden stool? Good night.